Well, welcome to this final panel this afternoon. And to introduce the panel is the chairman who is going to be managing it, Mike Shires. Mike is on our faculty here in the School of Public Policy. Mike is has a background that I like a lot because it combines not only a degree from Rand in a PhD in public policy. By the way, Rand, together with Henry Brady's Berkeley, I shouldn't start down the list now, but of the original 6 or so schools of public policy, I believe Rand and Berkeley were both in the original group. And Berkeley and Rand and the Kennedy School and several others. Although Jack's program predates public policy as a discipline, back, I'm going to say 1920s or 30s. 20, I think Syracuse was a couple of years before you.
First actual school, then us, and then the next school before was actually.
Yeah. So anyway, we've Pepperdine. Our bragging rights is that we're one of the younger ones, and we've got a Malibu campus.
Thank you so much. That's helping today.
Mike Shires has his PhD from Rand, but he also has an MBA, and he has spent some time in the business world at one time in his life. When the Public Policy Institute of California was formed, an outstanding think tank up in Sacramento to focus on California issues, Mike was the first person they hired to be one of their research people. And so we stole him from PPIC. And he is the anchor faculty member for us for our state and local issues. And because of his MBA partly, he and I taught it the first year, and he's taught it most of the years since then, our course that kind of attempts to bring the best of an MBA and apply it to public policy. Is Mark, I don't know if Mark is in the audience here, but another Mark Moore.
Here I am.
He's up here.
I hope.
You know, when I designed this class, because I'd been dean of the business school and I wanted something I could still teach in public policy because that's not my field. So I designed a course in which I thought I was bringing the best of an MBA into implementing public policy, and it was a class I was going to teach. And on a plane, and I'd worked out the syllabus, and I was on a plane going somewhere, and I read a review of this book called Creating Public Value, and I thought, that sure sounds a lot like my syllabus. And I ordered the book, and Mark Moore, his table of contents almost directly mirrored my syllabus. So he's a genius. Anyway, we're delighted to have all of you here for this final panel of the day. And Mike, I'll let you introduce it.
Thanks, Jim. I think there's 2 things the audience probably heard. One is I'm going to manage this group, which we saw last time doesn't work so well. And the second, the word dinner. And so one of the exciting things about this conversation is that we've built up to kind of where we are today. And our panel today is going to spend some time talking about the impact of moral sense and on character on the profession of public policy, and specifically how it's affected the lives of people who practice and work in this area. And James Q. Wilson is clearly maybe the Renaissance man of this era in many ways, because of his passion for integrating multiple perspectives and disciplines that people didn't normally lump together. And the second part of it was he wasn't afraid of the human aspect or the data aspect. And that's just uncommon in the field historically. But it has set a new model for us. And I thought about how I would introduce this session, and I tried to think of something brilliant to say, like many of my colleagues have. And I realized that the words of James Q. Wilson in many ways his own words describe the kinds of things that I think we're going to be talking about in this session. So I just wanted to read a couple paragraphs from Moral Sense. It says, "I do not think one can easily give general answers to these important questions. The truth, if it exists, is in the details. This book is about the details. It is about the result of scavenging through science in order to illuminate everyday life. The scavenging was not motivated by the belief that the propositions science can affirm are akin to the rules by which we live. In fact, most of the time we do not live by rules at all, but by habits and sensibilities. To say the same thing in different words, I'm not trying to discover facts that will prove values. I'm endeavoring to uncover the evolutionary, developmental, and cultural origins of our moral habits and our moral sense. But in discovering these origins, I suspect we will encounter uniformities, and by revealing uniformities, I think we can better appreciate what is general, non-arbitrary, and emotionally compelling about human nature." His question was always why? Why do these things happen the way they do? And he was a passionate student of that. And so our panel today has three people who've encountered this in their lives. And as a PhD in public policy, James Q. Wilson's work in many ways shaped the field that I live in terms of integrating the quantitative with the non-quantitative, the qualitative, the values, the political. And our three panelists are going to take it from slightly different perspectives. I'll leave their bios to the program that you have, but I do want to just talk for a couple seconds about the perspectives that they're going to bring. Steve Tellis is associate professor at Johns Hopkins. He's a political scientist, and he'll be starting his conversation at least from the perspective of the political science profession and moving from there. Dr. Mark Moore, who has more titles and names and chairs at the Kennedy School than we have time to go through. But one of the most important items on that list that I do want to highlight is he was the founding chair of the Kennedy School of Government's Committee on Executive Programs. And as such, one of the focal points of his work for the better part of a decade was looking at how professional education for practicing policy professionals should unfold. And he'll be sharing his thoughts about how that has unfolded in the lives of the Kennedy School program. And more generally, the field. And then our third speaker is Angela Hawken, who's a colleague of mine here at the School of Public Policy, who, and this is very high praise, I think epitomizes in many ways the values that James Q. Wilson carried through his example in his life. She has a deep passion for scholarship and using data to drive choices, but beyond that, she's not willing to take on the complexity of the questions, much as James Q. Wilson. And so she's going to share how that tradition, how James Q. Wilson's tradition has really shaped the practice of policy from her perspective, and to take us down that sort of practical application, and in some ways set the stage for tomorrow's conversation when we talk about what does this mean for the future of public policy and public policy education. So with that, Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so before I start, I should stipulate two things. One, I went to sleep last night at 3:30 a.m. in my body clock, so you can apply whatever discount rate to my comments on that basis that you want. And second, I'm staring into interrogation lights. So hopefully, having lowered your standard of expectation, we can move on from there. So unlike many of the distinguished scholars at this conference, I was neither Jim's colleague or student, and not even really a collaborator, beyond overseeing a little work for him on the implementation of the stimulus he was doing at the end of his life. Basically, I represent the much larger group of those who interacted with Jim through his writings. I'm also not a conservative, as so many of the people here are, and that to be said, the broader group of people who looked for guidance from Jim were. But like Giulio and Galston and some others, paraphrasing the famous Saturday Night Live skit in which a baseball player named Chico Escuela says, as the entirety of his paid speech, "Baseball has been very, very good to me. Conservatism has been very, very good to me." I'm a liberal who I like to think learned from conservatives how to be a better liberal, and to be a liberal who tries to help conservatives be better conservatives. I think a healthy polity, in fact, is in part defined by whether we have this sort of boundary crossing, poaching and crosstalk. And when we don't, as we increasingly do not, we really are in serious danger. So what is it that I got from Jim, both as a political scientist a student of public policy, and as a liberal. I would say the most important thing that one draws from bureaucracy, political organizations, the Amateur Democrat, which almost no one's mentioned, but I think is quite an important book, Varieties of Police Behavior, is what I'll call, playing off the theme of this conference, the organizational sense. I should also mention that I completely rewrote this right after right after Bill Galston's talk, so if there are any incoherence is also due to that. So the organizational sense, or what I would call the organizational sense, is not something that nature or evolution or whatever you want to call it has equipped us with. The small groups in which our basic constitutional features evolved are radically different from the world of large, impersonal, multi-divisional, multi-level, multinational organizations. In fact, organizations woven into a network of other organizations. To be able to comprehend this world of complex organizations requires us to develop what, for a somewhat different purpose, Rousseau conceptualized as a second nature. The organizational sense is that learned set of instincts for understanding how complex organizations work, what they can and cannot do, and the risks associated with creating them and deploying them to solve complex problems. The absence of an organizational sense is something we see all around us. Our TV programs are, for instance, full of conspiracies. I should say conspiracies, many of which I enjoy. But I think the thing that distinguishes a person with a developed organizational sense and one who does not is the propensity to respond to the possibility of conspiracy with a skeptical question: could something like that actually be executed? So again, I enjoyed Oliver Stone's movies, but I always got caught around the fact that nobody could have really coordinated the Kennedy assassination like that. Only somebody with an organizational sense would see the problem that way. I think another example of the lack of an organizational sense is our tendency in trying to understand the workings of the economy to imagine it as a gigantic aggregation up from person-to-person exchange. In fact, our economy is made up of complex organizations who must solve incredibly different coordination problems, which lack a unitary will, and which are as much sites for contestation as they are unitary actors with coherent interests. Organizations are not individuals writ large, and their behavior requires implanting instincts largely outside those that Jim identified with the moral sense. So the organizational sense begins with an appreciation of the difficulty of joint action, of coordination, and in particular with altering the behavior, the difficulty of altering the behavior of operators in the field. Jim's organizational sense led him to focus squarely on the teacher in the classroom, given unclear guidance as to what to teach and how. The cop on the beat asked to handle the situation, famously in Varieties of Police Behavior. The interest group leader who needed to keep the lights on and make payroll. Jim's work was a frosty tonic to missionaries of all sorts because he kept his gaze squarely at the mundane work associated with coordinating ordinary human beings in organizations far larger than any of those that our natures have equipped us with instincts to apprehend. So Jim's truly great books, and again, we all have our own tastes, and I would say the Amateur Democrat, Bureaucracy, Political Organizations, and Variety of Police Behavior are the ones that come to the top of my list. Explain to us how people doing superficially similar things could nonetheless behave quite differently. Jim was, in this sense, the ultimate splitter in an era in which the power in the social science was moving toward the lumpers. But Jim's splitting was not just a temperament, it was a method. He and his students actually got out in the field, interviewing bureaucrats, lawyers, interest group leaders, cops, political activists, prison guards, in the case of John, and regulators in an era in which political scientists were retreating to the computer lab. And out in the field, the sheer variety of political experience could not be denied. Where many economics-influenced students of bureaucracy had modeled government agencies as maximizing the size of their budget, the ultimate lumper argument, Wilson simply observed that many agencies willingly accepted a reduction in their budgets or the removal of entire programs. The more one dug around, Wilson argued, the clearer it was that agencies behaved very differently depending on the tasks they performed and the relationship to the political environment, the great argument of bureaucracy. There were things we could say about how bureaucrats facing different tasks in the environments might behave, but nothing particularly useful we could say about the behavior of bureaucrats as such. Improving the behavior of these bureaucrats, therefore, depended on durably altering the structural situation that they faced on a day-to-day basis. I'll come back to this. I think in this sense, Jim was a structuralist. Jim also had brilliant things to say about the behavior of interest groups. In his great book, Political Organizations, Jim observed that no matter how lofty their goals, every interest group and social movement still had to engage in what he famously called organizational maintenance. How groups are structured, how they get the resources to do their work, and the constraints placed on leaders all determine their behavior just as much as their beliefs that they're supposed to act upon. This is a lesson that I must say, and again, this is a case where I do think Jim's work has applications out in the real world and is not just of theoretical significance. Foundations involved in social change often overlook this point. They focus too much on how organizations they fund say, or what organizations they fund say they are for, and too little on how they're constituted as organizations. I should note this was an error that, for instance, Jim Pearson, who's here, did not fall into, something I admire as a student of organizations and regret as a liberal. While Jim was definitely not a lumper, the targets of his books typically were the lumpers like Bill Niskanen or Mansur Olson. He was a fairly rigorous splitter. Jim's work was an alternative to reductionism, the attempt to reduce all political behavior down to a single fundamental fact or force, to flatten the diversity of political things. Jim's was, by contrast, I would say, a moderate flattener. He didn't go in for thick description in which all behavior is rendered as idiosyncratic and incomparable, that is not flattened at all, but he didn't seek to make everything fundamentally alike either. Put another way, Jim's political science was neither sought to ape physics or economics on the one hand, nor anthropology on the other. Jim was basically, as some people have said, a categorizer. My friend Dan Carpenter has already written an elegant essay on this feature of Jim's thought, which I strongly recommend to you, and I recommend you all read it. In brief, Dan focused on the fact that Jim was a categorizer par excellence, and drew attention to the fact that categorization is fundamentally an art. His art drew on particular pieces of knowledge that could be systematic and capable of quantification: surveys, agency data, contributions to organizations, ethnography. And Jim was not hostile to this social science at all, a point that in many cases some of the more theoretically oriented people who believe they are Wilsonians often forget. But the act of categorization, in particular the generation of categories in the first place, was not susceptible to the kinds of methods that Jim's source material often was. Jim's method, it seems to me, was to seek out such diversity as exists in the world, to start out by seeking variety, then to learn as much as he could based on a variety of different sources, based on different ways of knowing, and out of that mix of sources, seeing the same thing from different angles, to present such categories as he thought emerged naturally out of a deep confrontation with the fact that to one kind of lesser man, to a lesser man might have seemed like mess or chaos, or to another lesser man might seem like all the same thing, Jim rendered into coherent categories of experience. In an era in which social scientists were madly seeking to become more like physicists or mathematicians, again, Jim generated a political science more like biology. He wanted to know what kind of things were out there, and as much as possible to present the categories that seemed derived from the most fundamental circumstances in which organizations were placed. At base, Jim's sense of natural variation ran deep, down to the core of human motivation itself. In The Amateur Democrat and Political Organizations, for instance, he showed just how deeply politics could differ when it was dominated by those with material incentives for participation, and those with what he called purposive incentives. Understanding politics and public policy depended on a searching, more or less ethnographically derived understanding of what was causing people to behave the way they were. Motivation for Jim could not be stipulated or treated as an assumption as in economics, since the character of motivation was in fact the whole game in many cases in explaining behavior. I should briefly note, as Angela may flesh out in her comments, or may not, that beyond simply explaining motivation, public policy needs to have ways to sort or triage individuals based on their motivations, because a policy that works for a person with one set of motivations could be a disaster for someone quite different. So for the most part, I think Jim, in his study of organizations, was a structuralist. He believed that the fundamental variety that characterized organizations was generated by features of the organizational environment and the task that the organization was presented with. Once an organization had generated an equilibrium, a term he would not use, but I will, between the nature of the task and the acquisition of resources and authority, its character was pretty much fixed, and change, if it happened at all, would be more or less at the margins. This led to a couple of implications. First, leadership of police departments, federal government agencies, interest groups, etc., was not one thing for Jim. Leadership was organization specific. This leads to the first payoff from Jim's thought, which is there are leaderships. There are different kinds of leadership. Not an infinite number, but as many as the fundamental variety of organizations would dictate. A good leader in a service police department would find himself entirely adrift in a service department in varieties of police behavior. A good leader of an agency with relative ease to measure outcomes could wreck another agency without clear, quantifiable results. One could say the same thing about reform. A reform that would make sense for an agency capable of easily monitoring subordinates could be a disaster for one that could not. Something similar could be said also about followership in Jim's model. Much of bureaucracy, very briefly, I think we referred to agency costs earlier, right? Much of the book Bureaucracy was responding to economists' model of agency costs in organizations. And in such models, the assumptions are generally that the only way to overcome agency costs is through surveillance, incentives, punishment, etc. But I think Jim's careful attention to motivation, as I mentioned before, and the variation of motivation, opened up all kinds of other ways of thinking about how these agency costs might be overcome. For example, he drew substantially on Herbert Kaufman's classic The Forest Ranger, which still rewards reading, which in part argued that agency costs can be overcome through training and other devices, creating an identification between the agent and his principal. This is also, of course, the function of basic military training, to break down the person and rebuild them as a Marine. That is, a person who would identify with the principal or, understood differently, their organization. The more we think of identity as a way of solving agency costs, the broader the field in which we can see it in operation. When I was writing an article on the Reagan Justice Department called Transformative Bureaucracy, I was also simultaneously reading Ian Kershaw's study of Hitler. No intended ideological comparison here, just to make that point. And in Kershaw's study, he observed that Hitler's management style, such as it was far from authoritarian in that he gave few direct orders. Rather, he used rhetoric to generate intense association with his followers, provided a sense of direction, and then expected them to compete to do what they thought Hitler would want without directly ordering it to be done. This Kershaw called thinking toward the Fuhrer, a concept that makes no sense in principal agent terms. I detected something similar in the Reagan administration, again, no ideological comparison intended, where I saw members of the Reagan Justice Department thinking toward Reagan, getting out ahead of him in anticipation of what they thought ultimately he would approve of. Human beings are not simply natural shirkers or subverters, in short. They also have other aspects of their nature which generate different kinds of organizational forms. In certain contexts, relying on these other motivations can be more effective in structuring an organization than relying on those that economists typically draw upon. So that said, I think that Jim was on balance a bit too much of a structuralist for my taste. I think Jim's structurally defined categories of the kind that he has in bureaucracy are the right place to start, but I think when we look at agencies over time, we see more play in the joints than he did. Jim did admit, for instance, that change in agencies could be driven by an alteration in the kind of professional background of agency operators, hiring economists rather than lawyers at the FTC, for example. But I think there's even more dynamism than Jim believed in the behavior of bureaucracies, even working, again, with the framework of his categories. That is, while the fundamental categories of organizations may be stable, Where organizations fit within these categories can change quite radically based on the decision of conscious strategic agents. But in what I think is a Wilsonian move, those agents create change by seeking to alter the structural variables that then serve to determine their behavior. Take, for example, the classification of agencies. Wilson classically created a 2x2 table, his most powerful tool, to explain organizations by the character of their task, based on the visibility of the organization's routines and results. So, for example, both schools and police in Jim's great Chapter 9 of Bureaucracy are classified as coping organizations because in neither case are routines or results visible. Note, I always thought outputs and outcomes was confusing, and I don't like using those terms. So Jim recognized, for example, that the Army could become a very different organization depending upon a shift in the nature of its task, that in wartime, the results produced by the Army become highly visible, but what it's doing becomes suddenly quite opaque, shifting it from a procedural to a craft organization. But there wasn't much evidence that an agency, from Jim's point of view, could consciously alter its organizational culture by altering the visibility of either its routines or its results. So for example, the introduction of CompStat dramatically altered the organizational character of New York City Police by suddenly making the perceived outcomes of the agency visible. Again, I'm saying I would want to make it constructivist and say perceived outcomes because it's not clear to they're making the actual outcomes visible. Again, visible both to superiors in the organization and its various constituents outside. Through doing that, it took a huge step toward becoming a craft organization, right? So in some sense, the organization itself made changes to its structural environment that itself then reverted back on its organizational culture. Something similar may also be happening to schools with the spreading of standardized tests, although we also may be moving toward trying to routinize routines as well as results, thus trying to turn schools into production agencies. Some of this dynamism is a consequence of things imposed upon organizations, some by entrepreneurial action by leaders, and some by the exogenous development of technology that allows for surveillance of the previously opaque. The same thing is true where the group environment surrounding an agency is concerned. In Jim's categorization, the EPA, for example, was an entrepreneurial agency, one with mobilized opponents but relatively unmobilized supporters. Now, Jim recognized that such agencies could be captured, in his terms, transformed into client agencies, but didn't really say much about the possibility that they could be transformed into interest group, or what he called interest group organizations, by the emergence of what Chris Basso referred to as Environment Inc., a dense network of environmental organizations that now loom as large in the agency's world as its business opponents. Some of this play in the joints may be generated by the agency itself, using its sometimes powerful resources to generate interest group supporters who can transform the agency's environment and thus its culture. But in either case, for a fuller understanding of bureaucracy, we really need to put Jim's elegantly designed categories into greater motion than I think he believed there actually was. Some of it motion consciously and strategically generated by creative agents seeking to create organizations that would behave in new ways. What does the organizational sense have to teach liberals? Let me give one example as a way of moving toward a conclusion. Last year, I published an article called Kludgeocracy, the American Way of Policy, in which I argued that the most impressive feature of American government as it has evolved is not to be understood on the left-right spectrum of the size or scope of government, but on the somewhat sideways axis of complexity or simplicity. In short, we've chosen for whatever particular public problem we've decided to address the most complicated possible mechanism for dealing with it. Ours is a world full of public-private partnerships, intergovernmental division of labor, steering, not rowing, and interagency cooperation. Whatever one says about such methods, they involve significant complexity in execution as compared to more brute force ways of responding to problems. As a liberal, I've increasingly become sympathetic to the idea that government should try, to the degree it can, to not try and be too elegant, cute, or targeted, but to aim as much as possible directly at its intended target, even with fairly blunt force instruments. The organizational sense that Jim implanted in my mind has not reduced my belief in the need for social insurance, for regulation, or for public goods, but it has sensitized me to all the ways that fortune has to frustrate those noble goals. So to conclude, 2 decades ago, Jim wrote a review of a book celebrating community policing for the Washington Monthly, a magazine on whose editorial board I serve and whose existence, I think, is in some sense very Wilsonian in its character. One quote from it sums up what I see as his whole worldview. Like most missionaries, the authors, again, of this book, do not pause to examine the problems and limitations of their strategy. Like all good converts, we are first asked to believe and only then question. I believe up to a point. At that point, I have some questions that, to my great regret, are not seriously addressed in this book. Jim understood missionaries. He often studied them, but he was not one of them. I am a liberal and thus believe that more can be done in that effort than Jim thought possible or prudent, but every time I begin to find my missionary zeal building up around some idea or the other, the James Q. Wilson instinct, the organizational instinct, taps me on the shoulder and asks me some uncomfortable questions.
So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry to have taken up so much airtime in the question period, and I'll try to keep my remarks brief here. I hope you'll let me begin on what's perhaps too personal a note. Jim has been a very important person in my life and my career, and so for many reasons of interest only to me and my therapist, I lived much of my life searching for mentors. And I needed not only their inspiration, but also their discipline. I was fortunate enough to live in a world where many were available, and James Q. Wilson was one. And it was to him that I often sought guidance in the construction of the constraint on me that would make me a better person. I also followed him in one other key respect, which is I made an early and long-term alliance with an excellent woman. And my wife and I were delighted to be friends of Jim and Roberta's and to raise our families together. And in many respects, I owe a great deal, not only to Jim's example, but to Jim and Roberta's example of what it meant to be husband and wife and father and mother. I mention this about mentorship. I think it's relevant to our topic for a couple of reasons. First, you have to know that I had always been a little ambitious. But I always wanted to be ambitious for good purposes, not just for myself. Gradually, I learned how hard it was to distinguish between these two, and that was an exercise in developing both character and a moral sense that continues today. I also liked ideas and argument and evidence, but I liked to think not about theoretical issues, but about social and political world and how it might be improved. Gradually, I learned how hard it was to develop ideas and arguments and evidence that could provide both the occasion and the basis for improving conditions in the world, and dealing appropriately with that loss of innocence was also an exercise in developing character in a moral sense. So I needed to find someone like Jim, a concrete embodiment of a person who seemed to be ambitious for good purposes, eager to improve the world through the force of intellect, and perhaps most importantly, wise, fearless, and realistic enough to be able to distinguish between what Max Weber once described as, quote, the feckless passion of Russian intellectuals on the one hand, from the passion that Weber thought was necessary for true statesmen, namely the passion in the form of matter-of-factness, the capacity to face the realities of a situation with a cool inner concentration that could guide effective action. Jim Wilson was perfectly cast for this role in the little drama of my life, and so I'm happy to talk to you about him today. At the time Jim was becoming an academic social science, I'm going to go quickly through a couple of points that I think have been made very well in previous presentations. At the time Jim was becoming an academic social scientist, the social sciences were struggling valiantly to become real sciences rather than an art, to be lumped together with the humanities. To become a real scientist in that world, one had to reject many things. One had to renounce an interest in values and morality for fear that commitments to moral ideas would cloud one's vision as a scientist. One had to commit oneself to clear, logical reasoning that could ideally be set out in a series of mathematical representations of how a particular causal system was thought to work. One had to commit oneself to developing and using precise concepts that could be given unique, clear definitions so that empirical instruments could be developed that would allow consistent, precise, objective evaluations of whether a cause or effect was or was not present and to what degree in particular situations. And it was best, in this view, if one worked on research projects that sought to stretch the frontiers of knowledge by following the immanent logic of the development of a particular academic discipline rather than the urgent and current problems of the day. As an academic researcher, Jim embraced these commitments. And one of the things to understand is I think he was always a little skeptical about the creation of the Kennedy School and worried that in important ways that this was going to corrupt rigorous and effective inquiry into conditions that were affecting the public and how they might best be improved, either by creating a kind of false science or trivial or claiming a kind of academic expertise which they didn't really deserve. So as an academic researcher, Jim embraced these commitments and he lived up to them, both in his early days as a scholar and later as he brought to bring both the findings and methods of social science to the practical world. When pushed, he would always return to these particular commitments as values that would guide and qualify academics and as values that he was determined to honor in his work. In these respects, and I think it's important to understand this, he had the character and moral sense of an outstanding social scientist seeking truths about human social behavior as well as a person who might want to live a public life as a leader or an intellectual or moral presence. The good news, though, is that Jim's moral sense and character moral sense and character as both an academic researcher and as a person who sought to have a valuable influence on the world pushed him beyond this comfortable definition of a distinguished, value-neutral social scientist drawing abstract pictures of the world that were tested in laboratories. Indeed, one of his most enduring contributions as an academic was to take the complex and scientifically contested idea of character and moral sense quite seriously as an important independent variable that could explain important parts of social life. To become a responsible social scientist, he thought, to become a useful public policy researcher, to become an effective advisor and leader in his own right, it was important in particular to crash through this frame of science that said you had to reject values in all of those roles, both as an explanation of why people were behaving, as an important thing to consider as a policy intellectual, and as something to animate and guide your own work and service as a leader. Now, I think we've all had our favorites about this question about what was Jim's best book, and in many ways I think Political Organizations was his best book because it was in that he began fleshing out and framing this different idea, or began constructing and developing and fleshing out the idea of what it meant to have a view of human nature that was not simply homo economicus, that included homo politicus and homo civicus as well. And as you know, in that book, he wrote about three different things. One of the things he wrote about was something he called material incentives. The other thing he wrote about was something he called solidarity incentives. And the last thing he wrote about was purposive incentives. And I think what's interesting is that as we've listened to the conversation today, those words, he's a great splitter and a useful splitter and stuff like that, but there's still work to be done, it seems to me, in parsing and understanding and talking about what goes into the constitution of those particular, I'll call them values. I always found it puzzling that Jim wanted to describe these things as incentives rather than values, and they seem more appropriate to me to describe them as values, and then to understand that they only became incentives if the pursuit of them became contingent on something, one's own behavior, right? So I think of them as values. And in our discussion today, the concept of solidary incentive turns out to be quite a complicated idea, not just a single idea. It includes the idea that of altruism, that you might have fellow feeling for other people. I thought Professor Soames' account of the idea that commitment to values might vary systematically over a larger and larger group population in the group, and that therefore the range of altruism would have different implications, et cetera, was very helpful and consistent with that line of attack. But it also included then this idea that there is something called a duty to one another. And what's different about the two is that a duty presupposes the existence of a social group that has constructed a norm, and then the desire on the part of the individual to align himself with that social norm and be rewarded in status and good standing by virtue of his or her willingness to behave in accord with that. And both of those had the characteristic of delivering to a collective group the kind of individual gratifications and incentives that would be necessary to overcome the free rider problem. And I think getting that clearly out in front of people was an important thing to do. The one other thing that's really got me thinking today, though, as I've listened to the conversation, was this idea of purposive incentives. And what's interesting about the idea of purposive incentives is it comes from his earlier work in politics, right? And so the way that you could understand purposive incentives is the idea that individuals held views about the aggregate social conditions in which they would like to live, not just for themselves, but for the society as a whole, right? And so in some sense, to use more classical language, they had an individually held idea of the good and the just, and that would constitute a reason for them to spend money, spend effort, spend time, et cetera, on behalf of that, if only somebody could help them find the means for the achievement of the common good and the properly identified as the just. Now that's all pretty interesting and straightforward, and as I say, it also included ideas about what was the right relationship between the government and individuals, or the government and other private institutions. So it's quite a complicated set of ideas that are held in this idea of a purposive incentive. But the most complicated bit of it, and this has been giving me a lot of trouble, has been this idea that we all know what it means for the government to act fairly or we all know pretty much what it means for the government to act fairly in its dealing with individual citizens, all right? What we're a little less clear about and spend a lot of time arguing about is what it means for the government to act faithfully on behalf of the enactment of just relationships and justice in the society at large, right? Because there's a substantive argument, of course, about what it is that we owe to one another that would be enforced by the state, all right? And so this idea of justice isn't then just an idea about how the government acts fairly and proportionally with respect to individuals, but how it calls into existence just relationships throughout the society and therefore in some weird way produces justice as well as, I don't know, what would the alternative be to produce it? It reflects it, or I don't know, something other than that. So I want to just draw attention to some additional work that needs to get done in that domain. I think it's also clear that Jim had this complicated view about how values, which he understood to be fundamental to the processes, and this goes to the question I asked this morning, to the processes that a society would use not only to act on a given set of problems it had already taken as its set of problems to solve, but also to define a set of purposes that would be worth trying to solve through public action, whether that public action took the form of privately initiated civic activity or publicly initiated government action. So if you imagine that individuals are walking around in the world with purposive incentives as well as solidary and material incentives, and they're comparing the world that they're seeing with their ideas about what a good and just world would be, then that presumably generates lots of motivation and energy to try to change things, right? If it turns out they find other people with whom they have the same interest, then they'll band together and try to nominate important conditions for civic or public action. And that then begins to give an account of what the political system would be like that would put on the agenda for public discussion and action the set of social conditions that we would either decide to embrace as an important public purpose or to reject as an important public purpose, and therefore would give us a sense of how much potential there was in the society as a large for taking on particular social actions. So, and I think, so let me go finally to this question I probably should have spent all my time on, which Steve has done a brilliant job of explicating, which is thinking a little bit about what Jim's ideas about moral sense and character has to do with the ability to lead and act in a society. And if it turns out that there are individually held but socially constructed values are important in guiding individual behavior, if those values were the motive force in individual and collective action, and if they were used by individuals and collectives to size up their individual and social condition, then once one turns one's attention to action in the world, rather than mere investigation of what was happening, then concepts of character and moral sensibilities would become an important part of the ingredient in effective public leadership. And this, I think, to understand that the world of public leadership is going to be one that is infused both in one's own heart by the values that one's trying to produce, but also by the degree to which those are aligned with the sensibilities of the rest of the population, is just a critical part of understanding what constitutes public action. One had to begin with an understanding that the public debate and action would have a significant moral component to it. If individuals who were pushing for the advancement of their own material interests in that sphere would have, those individuals who are pushing only for their own material advancement would have to find some way to explain to themselves and others why their particular material interests should attract public attention. If there's what principle of the good or charitable or just could be used to explain public action toward their particular material interests. One also had to understand that many individuals were not pursuing their own material self-interest under a cover, but instead were acting on the basis of a more or less idiosyncratic and more or less credible view about what it could and should be done to improve the collective welfare. This discussion, with its complex mix of manipulation and self-deception on one hand, and its glimpses of a path towards the good and the just, was the stuff of public discussion, action, and leadership. To enter into that world was to take on the burden not only of trying to question and guide the public discussion, and this was the hard part, it seems to me, but also to learn from it. And as Mark Kleiman observed, it takes an odd mix of arrogance and humility to enter into the particular political lists of engaging with the population over the question of what is it that we owe to one another, and what is it that we value together, and what is it that we can produce together, and how is the work going to get divided up. And that's the important task of public leadership. I think that part of this, well, I was about to say something about, I think that how to get into an effective conversation about public values in our life, in our contemporary life, and how to use that to galvanize the moral sentiments of the population and engage the moral sentiments of the population, could have drawn Jim more fully into the domain of religion. And I think he was sort of moving slightly in that direction as a place, as a source of where civic values were being created and from which some useful energy might be drawn. But I think he was enough of a Burkean to be worried about the moral zeal that might be unleashed with using religion. And so he didn't go as far as he might have in that respect, it seems to me. I think when you think about, he didn't speak directly about what he thought was the important method that a person who wanted to engage in public leadership, whether that be from a government agency platform or from the platform of a policy advocacy organization or from the platform of a nonprofit organization or the platform of a private organization, he didn't speak exactly about what he thought those people should do. His account that he gives in his books is as Steve describes it, which is that he tended to see all those people as things that were being constrained and controlled by external environments, the requirements of the task on the one hand and the requirements of the political environment on the other. And yet, in his arguments about this, he did eventually say that he thought, had two ideas, it seems to me. One of them was that the public leader and manager, even of a government agency, did work and tried to work to create the autonomy to be able to lead the organization. Then he had to fight for that in a very difficult circumstance. And and you could think, well, yeah, it's nice if I could get some autonomy so I don't have to answer to this blizzard of competing demands that surrounds me. But I think that Jim also thought that it was in that little bit of discretion that was generated that the opportunities for effective public leadership were created. And then came the big question. If I now have some autonomy, if I now have some discretion, if I fought for it, what should I do with it? And it was at that moment that I think you had to reach into your own self as well as into your sense of where the public was, to your own character and your own moral sensibilities to see what was worth doing, and even to figure of the degree to which you were prepared to challenge some of the constraints of the environment in which you were operating on behalf of an important public virtue that was being neglected, right? And I think that what's remarkable about Jim, so let's see, I'm struggling here a little bit, but it was this weird place in which our most intimate relationship that Jim and I had was never one that we discussed very much. And he was over there in the government department doing studies that explained why government leaders and bureaucracies were fundamentally constrained. And I was over in the Kennedy School teaching individuals about how they could overcome those constraints and move that organization, right? And so the question was, well, what were we saying to one another about that sort of stuff, right? And the answer to that, I think, turns out to be that I thought, and Jim, I think, kind of agreed with this, that there was more variety in the political authorizing environment than Jim saw. There was more room to maneuver. And there were techniques that would be normatively acceptable and even perhaps normatively valuable that a manager could use to engage in the political conversation about what the purposes of an enterprise ought to be. And then further, that there was a more problem on the task environment side and more variety there, and therefore some discretionary choices to be made about how a government organization would be positioned in a varying and dynamic task environment. And that the challenge then was for an executive to, using his moral character and sensibility, to imagine a plausibly valuable, publicly valuable thing to do that he could use to, with the assets that have been entrusted to his organization, to achieve the desired result. And I think, I don't think I would have had the courage to talk about the subject of public managers trying to create public value using the assets that have been entrusted to them and trying to construct a effective public conversation about what constituted value and trying to find a way to engage the employees not only for their paycheck but for their mission, right? If Jim hadn't brought to the fore this idea of character and moral sensibilities. So I feel like he and all the individuals that I've had the privilege to instruct over many years at the Kennedy School have been incredibly influenced, and ideally, hopefully for the best, by Jim's constant insistence that the question is what's valuable, what's good, what's right to be done in this particular instance with whatever position you happen to be in. So thank you.
Oh, I'm on. As an employee of this university, I feel compelled to start by making some observations about the weather. It really isn't usually like this. Really, it's not. And to give an example of this, this morning very early, my 5-year-old son woke me up, and he pointed to the window and he said, "Mommy, the windows are wet." And I had to, 2 observations followed from that. The first was my children really need more exposure to actual weather. And the second was I probably need to wash my windows more frequently if my sons are this surprised by the wetness of the windows. I was asked as part of this panel to reflect on James Q. Wilson as a policy influential. I don't know whether he would have wanted to view himself as a policy influential or not, but whether he wanted to or not, he was directly or indirectly influential for many, many, many policy choices and policy decisions that were made. So in thinking about this, I was wondering from a much less sophisticated level than all of my esteemed colleagues on these previous panels, but why was he such an influential influential person? I think to begin with, I started thinking about his performances at the last few Reagan Library lectures that he gave and was stunned. I was doing the count in some of them, and at least 1 in 4. In one of the sessions it was 1 in 4, and another one it was 1 in 3, when his response to a question was, I don't know. And it was, I don't know, not followed by an apology trying to like supplement with something else to say, so he sounded as though he was filling airtime, but it was, I don't know next. Which is really surprising from an intellectual way. So often we feel as though we have to fill airtime. And I think as a result, people paid so much more attention when he was responding to a question on something, because we always knew, we were guaranteed that that was a reasoned response, not this gut response of an academic who thought they had to say something. So his ability to get to know very quickly and unapologetically I held him in really high esteem as a result. From somebody who's a policy researcher and who likes to get out into the field also, another reason I think he was so important, certainly among the policymakers and practitioners, was his ability and willingness and eagerness to get outside of the ivory tower. He left the universities, he went out into the field, he walked among the people who he was studying and who he was supposed to be providing with prescriptions on how to do things better. And that really differentiated, and he loved data, and so do I. I'm a big data person also. But that ability to get out into the field too and really engage practitioners really marked him, put him in a different camp from so many other similar intellectuals. He was very, very engaging with practitioners. Still today, I meet regularly with police chiefs, and there's no other academic they refer to as often or as lovingly as James Q. Wilson. And part of that was just because of the respect he afforded to them. He really, often academics will swoop in with our briefcases and with all our solutions, and we're very quick to get to recommendations. And he did exactly the opposite. He would sit and be quiet and observe and listen, and really respected the input that practitioners gave him in ways that I think many others have not really valued the contribution of the people in the front lines trying to do. And I'm speaking primarily in terms of his work on crime now. But his listening to others gave him a great credibility among practitioners, and they loved him. And still today, I guess it's starting to change now a little bit, Mark. You're also out and about. But if I go into offices, and I travel once a week to another part of the country, and I'm always in an office of some practitioner, and on the wall will be a book by James Q. Wilson and increasingly now Mark Kleiman. They have really been so influential in terms of educating decision makers and practitioners about the importance of looking to data. What do we know, and what information can we glean from the evidence that is available to us? It's very obvious to me why James Q. Wilson was so comfortable with his relationship with Rand. When I first started at Rand, I suddenly, I had come to the United States because I had been taken hostage, and I was suddenly interested in crime, and I'd been a labor economist, and I decided to join the RAND research group that was dealing with issues that had to do with crime, which this is the origin of my interest. And within the first week of my interviewing and then getting a position on that team, I was told, well, you're interested in, how about 3 strikes, maximum security, 3 strikes? And I said, fine. And they said, okay, well, can you get there next week? When you get there next week? Well, maximum security prisons, of course. You're going to Tehachapi, middle of California. I just arrived in California at this point, and the thought of driving on the wrong side of the road into the middle of the state. In South Africa, we drive on the correct side of the road, and it was a little daunting. And then to spend my formative weeks, in custody. And one thing that was really surprising to me in my first initial conversations with James Q. Wilson at RAND, and he wasn't really ready to give me much airtime, I must confess. He was in a hurry and there were other brilliant people to talk with. But the day he heard that I had spent so much time in custody was the day he actually started listening to me. And that day he gave me a full 5 minutes, which in PhD candidate world was an extraordinary gift, and we continue to have a very nice relationship after that. But that ability to get outside of the ivory tower was something I've learned to model on since and really appreciated in him. Influence creates influence. Shep Melnick, in his discussion earlier, noted one of Wilson's concerns was the damage of putting too much faith in intellectuals. When Daniel Patrick Moynihan introduced James Q to President Nixon, he referred to him as the smartest man in America. And that reference has been repeated many, many times. Well, the weight of being the smartest man of America, I would love to know what James Q's position would be on how much should people have listened to James Q, and how influential should he have been allowed to be. That's a conversation I know he would not have backed away from. And for those of you who know him better, if you know what his perspective was on that, I would really love to know. Because there's a lot of responsibility in being somebody that the world takes so seriously. Especially, what sort of responsibility would somebody like that have if they do in fact change their mind, which James Q. Wilson did? Does he have a responsibility to then go out and set the record straight? And we think about this in terms of incarceration. When the crime rates were coming down already, there was still a frantic move to build prisons. And in many states, there were still many people going before their legislatures and justifying the construction of new prisons, referencing James Q. Wilson's work. I mean, he was one of the biggest intellectual defenders of the incarceration movement in the United States. And he had already changed his mind, but he was relatively quiet, I think. And maybe I'm wrong on that. But he was relatively quiet in terms of pulling back his position on that. And we did see many, many prisons still being constructed after he had even started to change his mind. And then in the same regard, given the massive intellectual power and influence that he was having, what responsibility does someone like that have when people either misunderstand or willfully misuse the work that they've created? And I think an important example of that was his work on broken windows. And I think, I'm not even going to explain that. Everybody in this room knows his work on broken windows. But I think Kelling in some ways, and James Q. in personal conversations would say, well, they took it too far. They didn't quite get it. We never really meant a zero tolerance approach. What we meant was the following things, that it really mattered how a community regarded itself, and that sometimes small things can really manifest in a way to have an important influence on how communities regard themselves, and often little things do matter. What they had never intended was a lot of the kind of uglier side of the zero tolerance policing that followed from that. And to what extent did those two authors have a responsibility to kind of scream into the wind and say, that's really not what we had meant by that. This is what we had meant instead. I don't know, and I'd like to ask him if he thought he did, and maybe he did not. And then finally, what did somebody who was such a policy influential, do they have any responsibility in terms of iterative improvements? The way that engineers are iteratively improving constantly over time with new models and improved models. Jim was very interested in moral behavior and what we could do to make up for deficiencies in moral behavior. And he was especially excited. Many of you would have heard him referencing nurse home visitation. There are very few preventative models that we know of that work as well as nurse home visitation. And what this is if you have a high-risk mother who's pregnant, the program is to send in a registered nurse who would then, we heard about this program earlier, who would basically coach this mother on good parenting. The program involved a registered nurse who made repeat visits to that home. So it doesn't take an economist to tell you very quickly that's an expensive program. And what we see as a result is really minor scale experiences of this. Very few high-risk children actually have exposure to this intervention, even though in terms of cost-benefit analysis terms, it blew everything else out of the water. Massive social returns to this sort of investment. But the problem was this had to take place within the fiscal budget reality of the institution right now. And even if the long-term rewards are stunning, well, right now something has to pay for it, and we don't have it, baby. Increasingly, as this conversation was unfolding, and I was starting to observe this, others were observing it, we were having this discussion with James. Again, I was not and am not the policy influential. So I'd like to have this conversation with him. We started to think, well, what was essential to that model? Can we decompose what is essential about that intervention? There was no blood being drawn. No prescriptions were being written. No injections were being given. You had a reasonably smart person who understood the world go into a very at-risk individual and pass some knowledge on. Did that really have to be a high-price registered nurse? He knew that. And I would have loved to have seen him maybe take a step and start to see more modifications to the program, because we still don't see it. It's such an obvious no-brainer thing to do. And he could have had that conversation. He could go into a place and say, that's a no-brainer. Let's try that tweak. And have much more influence in doing that than someone like I would. And I don't know if he backed off from this. He didn't really want to be looking as though he was giving prescriptions, because you had to be careful. Maybe the data on that would change. So I feel a little bit like this. Like, what was his responsibility? Should he have been chasing those changes? Or should he have backed off and said, this is where the evidence is now, let's see if this transition happens, where the evidence goes. So I really wish we could have those conversations with him. People really resonated with his work. He worked on issues that all of us could identify with. You know, the family, the role of the family, the role of the community in shaping moral behavior. The nature versus nurture thing is so depressing if you really believe that everything is genetic in the end, right? That we have no influence over the outcomes of our children. And thankfully there really is still, you know, if we add up all the variations and all the pieces that count for something, well, there is still space for family and community to shape, you know, the behavior of our children and the members of our community. And I think that really resonated. And he really felt strongly in the role of families and community in terms of helping people figure out self-control, helping people shape their decisions and behavior. Clarity of expression, I think, was very important in terms of why he was so influential also. And I could be wrong on this, and I'd love to see what the professors from Harvard have to say. But I personally, if you look at James Q's resume and remove the fact that he was stunningly well known, do you seriously think he would get tenure today at Harvard? Probably not, right? The list of peer-reviewed publications was stunningly short for James Q. Wilson. He wrote for people. He wanted to get the word out. He was so excited by the ideas, he really wanted to get them out. And he wrote about them so beautifully in ways that the mass of the public could understand what were otherwise really complicated ideas. And I think it's another reason why he just became such a huge, giant name, was that he really was writing for all of us, and not just the 200 people who happened to read a very specific edition of some very specific journal. I think the other reason he's been so stunningly influential, and this has affected me and now my team, is just how very inspirational he was. Not only because he was so darn interesting and so interested in ideas and chasing ideas, and yes, he loved data, and I love data, so how can you not like a guy who likes data? But because he was just so excited about the ideas you were starting to form. And I think this is what made him genius. And when he came to visit my classrooms especially, this is where I found him genius. And I talked about this when I was at Rand too, that he could take a seed. Like, sometimes my students would not have very good ideas. Sometimes it happens. Usually they have great ideas. But sometimes they have a not so great idea. And James Q. Wilson would take their hand in conversation and move that nugget into something really astonishing, and let that student leave the room thinking that they too were an intellectual giant. They were on the cusp of something monumental, and that they had to go out and further investigate and accumulate knowledge. And that trick he played on my students, I realize now he played on me all the time. Because every time I left a conversation with him, I thought, I'm on the cusp of genius. I must study this. And then I realized later it's just because he was interested in the answer to the question. He was using me as one of his pawns to go out there and collect information because he was excited by it, and we were too. And together, all of us, in pursuit of knowledge and data, could start to figure things out. That ability to inspire, I don't know anybody else that was able to inspire me as readily after a conversation to go out and pursue more knowledge. What a remarkable thing to say about somebody, I think. Two final comments. The first is, I think, where it really separates him from so many other academics and intellectual giants is his willingness to change his mind. I really saw this in two regards. The first is when I first met James Q. Wilson, it was at Rand. And I had pitched him my introductory idea to my PhD dissertation. And he said, okay, tell me the issue, tell me the methods. And actually, he might have asked for it in reverse. Tell me the methods, then tell me the issues. And I told him the methods, and I had him on my team. Good. Like the methods, you may proceed. What's the issue? And I told him what the issue was, and he was too sophisticated for this, but if I'm doing my impression of me as James Q. Wilson, he went, eh. He would never go, eh. But that's essentially what I had from how he responded to the issue. But the methods were good, so go do it, see what you find. And what I did find 2 years later, and again in a presentation at Rand, and he was on the board of visitors at Rand, and just for those of you who aren't familiar with board of visitors, they're made up of wealthy people and smart people, and sometimes there's a nexus, and at Rand there actually is a stunning nexus between the two. And he was part of that committee that I was thrown into, and it was very daunting to give that initial presentation to him because I had known about his going into this, that he wasn't especially enthusiastic about the topic. And the day that I presented the results, he came to me afterwards and he said to me, Angela, you've changed my mind. And I wasn't setting out to change his mind, but it was so fun to see somebody who 2 years ago was so, this is never going to work. And the goal was not to prove it to work or not to prove it to work, but just to see what happened. And just to follow up, and this is a bit of an academic tragedy, is about 3 years after that, I went back to him and said, it actually did work during that honeymoon phase, but 3 years later it stinks up a storm, man, you were right. So he changed his mind back again equally quickly when, in the face of fuller evidence, I was actually able to show that his initial perception of the problem was spot on and mine was way off. Another case of changing his mind, and I think this is important, is James Q, when he first heard of the work Mark and I were involved with in Hawaii, was very enthusiastic about the work. Basically, it involved swift and certain punishments. He got the swiftness, he got the certainty. He always believed in swiftness and certainty. That generated more feeling of fairness. If you could respond swiftly and with certainty, people understood that you were punishing that behavior rather than being arbitrary. That speeding up the system had great returns. And that certainty also, would make people change their behavior. If you were able to deliver a dose of punishment, really, with some certainty, people would try to avoid that punishment. As humans, we don't like to be punished. Punishment is unpleasant. But what he didn't really comment on much, and I think this is where we really surprised him with our work, was on the magnitude of the punishment. And what we had found, and this is the slide he would stop me on when I showed him the first results of the trial, the randomized control trial in Hawaii, was that we really could substitute swiftness and certainty for severity. If you can speed it up, you can punish less, as long as you punish every time. Monitor closely, punish every time. You can give tiny little doses and get the same result. Well, we had a situation, and he loved this finding. Our offenders were kind of randomized to different judges, and some judges were just more trigger happy than others, because judges, you can't tell judges what to do. And Mark's favorite phrase is, it's easier to change offender behavior than judge behavior. That really is true. So some judges would give a month for a similar sanction. Others would get 2 weeks. Others would give a week. Others would give a week. Some would give 4 days. Some would give 3 days. And what we found in our research was absolutely no difference. Whether the dose was high or the dose was low, same outcomes. Track them for a year, just nothing there. He was very interested in that result, and I think that helped to speed along his thinking also about incarceration. Have we really been using this resource well? Probably not. As new results come in, as we move this model across the country, I keep missing him over and over again. And I would be especially excited for him to see results from RAND now, which show that 1 day in custody, and again, not to say this is a general theory on desistance from crime, but looking at the RAND work on felony DUI offenders, 1 day in custody, 5 hours in custody, 1 hour hold, same results. These are stunning observations. We'll see yet if they replicate over and over again. But I know more than anything that there's no person on earth that would have been more fascinated by that result. I wasn't going to talk about triage, but now you've made me. James Q. Wilson really loved the triage curve that followed from our initial trial, and that is people who were repeat drug offenders, had long histories of drug use, when introduced into a system of consistent sanctioning and appropriate incentives, can simply stop using. This was a very uncomfortable finding for National Institutes of Health. And Sally would talk about the brain disease model, because if you have a brain disease, how is it that you can stop? And in most cases, pretty quickly. Now, not everybody stopped, which maybe means that there might still be a case for brain disease, but applied to a tiny portion of the population. What we found is that 85% of hardened drug users were able to desist when, and these were regular drug users, when appropriate incentives were applied. And the idea being, I use the label behavioral triage. Don't tell them, don't ask for a conversation, just say we're going to watch you. Test regularly and watch. And those people who can stop using don't need a cent of government-funded treatment, because they can stop using on their own. And those who can't, we can now take the government-funded treatment and give them Cadillac quality care. Because up until this finding, we've really been spreading everything around, and everybody got a little bit of nothing. Being able to allocate our resources differently has made a big difference. He loved that triage result, and we're learning so much more about that now. Final comment, and this will be a quick one. What I admired most about Jim was how his opinions were appreciated on both sides of the aisle. If you're a conservative, being hated by the other side does not make you a better conservative. The same is true if you're a liberal. The marker of an intellectual giant is that when you speak on both sides of the aisle, they put down their pencils and they pay attention. And when James Q spoke, everybody listened. Thank you so much.